History is often told through big names, clearly victorious, symbols chosen to represent an entire era. But there are places that don't fit that narrative. They didn't crumble in war. They didn't disappear in disaster. They were simply overlooked. Château de la Napoule is one such place, a structure that still stands, but the life that created it has been almost erased from mainstream history. This isn't a story of collapse. It's a story of how history chooses to be silent. There are places that weren't built to become symbols. They weren't created to be etched into history, weren't positioned as centers of power, and weren't prepared to be destinations of collective memory. Château de la Napoule is one such place. From afar, the structure is easily mistaken. The stone towers are reminiscent of medieval fortresses. The thick, low, and heavy walls face the Mediterranean, as if still guarding against a threat that no longer exists. But Napoule never truly belonged to a single era. It didn't hold within it a decisive historical moment. It wasn't born to mark victory, nor to commemorate defeat. From the beginning, Napoule was a structure nestled between narratives, and that's precisely what makes it uncomfortable for mainstream history. In the earliest historical documents, this area appears as a small coastal defense position in Provence, built not out of ambition for expansion, but out of fear. Fear of pirates, fear of invading fleets, fear of the perpetual instability of the medieval Mediterranean, where the line between trade and war was always thin. Napoleon was then not a symbol of power, but an expression of lingering anxiety. Importantly, Napoleon was never the center of any empire. It did not belong to the French monarchy. It was not associated with a powerful dynasty spanning generations. It does not appear in grand chronicles, where history often favors palaces, capital cities, and battlefields. Even while it held a military role, Napoleon remained a small, easily replaceable, easily forgotten link. As feudal orders crumbled, as fortresses ceased to be the answer to modern warfare, Napoule lost the single function that had once justified its existence. No heroic tale accompanied its decline. No day of fall, no final battle. Only the slow retreat of humanity, leaving behind stone, sea salt, and time. For nearly a century, Napoule existed as an uncontested ruin. It wasn't beautiful enough to be a Gothic romantic icon, nor important enough to be preserved by the state. The walls eroded. The watchtowers crumbled piece by piece. Nature encroached upon the space once designed to resist it. And it was during this period that Napoule began to form its most important role, a place not tightly controlled by history. Orthodox history has a clear tendency. It prefers orderly narratives. There is a beginning, a climax, and an end. There are heroes, villains, and moral conclusions. Places like Napoule, failing to meet that structural standard, are often set aside, not because they lack value, but because their value is not easily recounted. By the early 20th century, when the Riviera became a refuge for the international elite, for the wealthy but not entirely European, Napoule reappeared on the map, not as a relic, but as an opportunity. But this was not an opportunity in the conventional investment sense. There was no obvious profit, no immediate symbolic value, only a dilapidated structure carrying an incomplete history and a faded reputation. And it was then that a man appeared, carrying a problem even greater than Napoule: how to live within history, but not submit to its logic. That man was Henry Clouse Jr. He didn't come here to restore a fortress. He didn't come to rewrite history in the usual way. Henry Clouse Jr. came to Napoule because it was a place whose fate had yet to be decided by history. And it was from that moment that the true story of Château de la Napoule began. To understand why Henry Clouse Jr. chose Château de la Napoule, one must return to a place entirely opposite to it. Not the Mediterranean coast, not the wind-eroded stone walls, but late 19th century America, where power was not built of stone, but of money, speed, and relentless expansion. Henry Cluse Jr. was born in the heart of that world. His father, Henry Cluse Sr., was one of Wall Street's most prominent financiers during what history would later call the Gilded Age. It was an era of nascent but aggressive capitalist empires, where banking, railroads, and heavy industry reshaped American society at a pace that law, morality, and culture could not keep up with. In that environment, power needed no ancient symbols. It asserted itself through economic dominance and the ability to dictate the pace of life for the entire society. Henry Cluse Jr. Growing up amidst opulent mansions, conversations about markets, stocks, and political influence, he was prepared for a socially predetermined role: heir, successor, and consolidator of the system that had given his family status and security. But it was within that very security that an early breakdown began to form. Personal records show that Henry Cluse Jr. possessed no shortage of potential to be a financier. He understood the logic of the market, the workings of power in modern society. But understanding did not equate to acceptance. From a very early age, he began to view the world around him through the eyes of an outsider, even though, in terms of status, he was at the center. Lavish parties, symbols of wealth, and confident pronouncements of progress left him feeling more empty than proud. That emptiness did not lead him to asceticism or a complete break with the world he was born into. Instead, it propelled him towards art. For Henry Cluse Jr., sculpture was not a pastime for the idle class. It was a tool, a way to dissect forms of power, to expose the contradictions that economic and political language often concealed. In his early works, he was particularly interested in distorted human forms, ironic faces, and classical symbols placed in a new context where their meaning became unstable. Choosing an artistic path in that context was not merely a personal decision. It was an act of soft resistance. Henry Cluse Jr. did not write anti-capitalist manifestos, nor did he stand on a podium to condemn the elite. He chose the more difficult path, living amidst power, but refusing to serve it with his creative life. And it was this choice that prevented him from ever being fully accepted, though not entirely excluded either. Europe, at the beginning of the 20th century, became the ideal space for this state of limbo. For many wealthy Americans, Europe was a place to seek cultural prestige, to embrace an air of antiquity that new money hadn't yet managed to create. But for Henry Cluse Jr., Europe held a different meaning. It was a place where history was so rich that it was no longer easily manipulated by personal ambitions. There, power had been built on stone, on bloodlines, and on violence, and thus, its decay was more evident. During his travels across Europe, Henry Cluse Jr. encountered ruins no longer revered, castles that had lost their function, structures that had once been centers of power, but were now mere shadows. It was in these spaces that he recognized a possibility, reusing decay as an artistic language, not for nostalgia, but to question the sustainability of all power systems, even those at their peak, like his own America. However, Henry Cluse Jr. was not alone in forming this worldview. Beside him was Marie Cluse, who would later become his wife and most important artistic partner. Marie not only shared the belief that art must question, but also brought another dimension, the experience of a creative woman in a society that still viewed serious art as a male domain. Marie Cluse refused to accept a subordinate role. She was not content with being the artist's wife. Her works focused intensely on the human condition, the fragility of body and mind before invisible social structures. Marie's presence prevented Henry Clous's Jr. artistic world from sliding into abstract aestheticism, keeping it firmly rooted in the question of the concrete human being, in the personal price paid for standing outside of dominant systems. When these two individuals approached Château de la Napoule, they saw not a mere property. They saw a complete metaphor. A structure once built for defense, once abandoned when it no longer fit the new order, and existing as an inconvenient relic in local history. Napoule reflects their own position in the modern world within history, but not at its center. Part 2 concludes here, as the pieces begin to connect. Henry Clous Jr., born into American financial power, and Marie Clous, an artist unwilling to be diminished, find in Napoule not just a place to live, but a space to express their full contradictions. But the crucial question remains unanswered: what will they do with that space? And what will be the price of that choice? In the next section, the story enters a decisive phase, the rebirth of Château de la Napoule, not as a restored historical structure, but as a living work of art where architecture, sculpture, and thought intertwine, and where conflict with mainstream history becomes inevitable. When Henry Clous Jr. and Marie Clous first stood before the crumbling walls of Château de la Napoule, they were not confronted with a structure in need of salvation, but with a fundamental question: did the past necessarily have to be restored to the form that history expected? Their answer, from the outset, was a refusal. They did not want to restore Napoule as a complete medieval fortress, nor did they want to transform it into a modern villa covered in an antique facade. They chose a third, the most difficult and least forgivable path: preserving the fragmentation. The rebirth of Napoule did not follow standard conservation logic. There was no attempt to return the structure to its original state of a particular century. Instead, what remained of the Middle Ages was preserved as a foundation upon which new layers of meaning were added. The defensive walls were not flattened to become more elegant, that they are left with cracks and erosion, evidence of the passage of time. Henry Clous Jr. did not see these marks as flaws. For him, they were language. That language was continued through sculpture. Not heroic statues, not symbols of glory, but distorted human figures, sometimes satirical, sometimes unsettlingly gloomy. The works were not placed in neutral spaces like galleries, but were directly integrated into the architecture. A statue appeared in a corner. A stone face looked down onto the courtyard. A small carving forced passers-by to bend down to see it. This arrangement broke the habit of admiring art from a safe distance. Viewers were drawn into an intimate, even uncomfortable, relationship with the symbols. Marie Clous played a decisive role in shaping the exterior space. The Napoule garden did not adhere to the strictly controlled aesthetics of French aristocratic gardens. The pathways don't lead directly to the center, and the viewpoints aren't arranged to create a sense of dominance over the landscape. Instead, it's a fragmented series of experiences where nature and man-made elements don't fully reconcile. Trees are allowed to grow out of control, a reminder that every human structure, however thick the stone, must yield to time. It is here that Napoule begins to become a living manifesto. Not a manifesto against history, but against how history is usually presented. In the 20th century, especially after World War I, Europe was rife with attempts to reconstruct memory. Nations wanted to restore faith, to rebuild symbols of stability after the collapse. Napoule goes against that trend. It doesn't promise stability. It exposes fragility. This wasn't without consequences. Napoule, under the hands of Henry and Marie Clous, became a space difficult to categorize. It wasn't historically faithful enough to be considered a legitimate monument, nor was it luxurious or opulent enough to become a symbol of Riviera extravagance. Local officials and traditionalists viewed the building with caution. They didn't openly oppose it, but neither did they support it. Napoule was left in limbo, existing but not fully embraced. This limbo reflected the very social standing of its creators. Henry Clouse Jr. had money, but didn't want the power that came with it. Marie Clouse had talent, but refused to be reduced to a decorative role. Napoule became a place where they could realize this contradiction without asking permission. But at the same time, it became the reason why they were unlikely to be recognized. History favors decisive choices. Napoule was a choice of deliberate indecisiveness. In the years that Napoule was nearing completion, the building didn't attract crowds. There are no massive crowds of visitors. Those who come are usually artists, intellectuals, or individuals seeking a space different from the usual pace of life. Napoule doesn't try to impress quickly. It demands time, and in an age where speed is increasingly seen as a measure of value, that means pushing oneself to the margins. This third part concludes with Napoule physically completed, entering a more difficult phase, existing as an anomaly within its historical and social context. A structure that doesn't serve collective memory in the familiar way, a space that questions instead of answering. And it is from here that the silent conflict with mainstream history begins to become clearer, though no one calls it out. In the next installment, the story shifts to the post-World War II era, where Henry and Marie Clouse must confront the biggest question on everyone's mind outside the system: what will happen to their legacy when they are no longer there to protect the original spirit? There is a moment when every legacy, whether built of stone or of ideas, must confront itself. It is the moment when the people who breathed life into it are no longer present to explain, defend, or debate. For Château de la Napoule, that moment arrived not with a crash, but with the slow retreat of time and people. In the late 1930s, Henry Clouse Jr. entered the final stage of his life. He was not a forgotten figure during his lifetime. Within small artistic and intellectual circles, he was known as a wealthy but unconventional man, an artist who did not pander to popular tastes, and an individual who always kept his distance from the power structures that had given him life. But that recognition never extended beyond its narrow circles. It did not translate into historical status. And when he died in 1937, that became clearer than ever. The death of Henry Clouse Jr. He did not trigger a wave of re-evaluation. There were no major conferences, no articles summarizing his place in 20th century art history. He left just as he had lived, quietly, without disrupting the larger currents. The remaining task, the burden of protecting Napoule and its spirit, fell to Marie Clouse. Marie Clouse understood very well the fragility of the legacy they had built together. She had no illusions that Napoule would be automatically protected by history simply because it was beautiful or unique. In a Europe descending towards total war, spaces like Napoule easily fell victim to indifference or destruction. Marie, in her final years, shifted from the role of artist to the role of guardian. Not guardianship through power or political influence, but through preventative legal and organizational decisions. It was during this period that the idea of handing Napoule over to a non-profit organization to maintain it as an open art space began to take shape. Marie Clouse did not want Napoule to become the private property of a new owner who did not understand or care about its original spirit, nor did she want it to be taken over by the state and flattened into an easily relatable, marketable relic. Her choice, therefore, continued along the familiar middle ground, not belonging to an individual, but not entirely to mainstream discourse either. When Marie Clouse died in 1959, Napoule entered the most perilous period of its life. 2 world wars had passed, leaving Europe with countless physical and spiritual wounds. Nations focused on reconstruction, on symbols necessary for unity and recovery. In that context, a seaside castle with a personal story, not tied to national heroes or collective tragedy, was not a priority. Napoule was not destroyed in the war, but it was set aside. This is the most insidious form of damage history can inflict. No violent act, no decision to remove it, only prolonged neglect. The statues remain, the walls stand, but the story of why they exist gradually fades into obscurity, preserved only in the records and memories of a select few. In the post-war years, as European heritage was reclassified and reorganized, Napoule continued to struggle to find its place. It was not ancient enough to represent the pure Middle Ages. It was not modern enough to be classified among the avant-garde movements. It was a hybrid object, bearing the marks of many eras, but not fully serving any one narrative. And in the logic of mainstream history, such objects are often silenced. This part 4 marks a crucial turning point. From this point on, the story no longer revolves around clear individual choices, but rather around how history deals with what is no longer protected. Napoule, after the deaths of Henri and Marie Clouse, becomes a test for the system of collective memory. It shows that the physical existence of a legacy does not guarantee the existence of meaning. Meaning needs to be retold, debated, and sometimes protected from simplification. In the next section, the story will delve into the period when Napoule was institutionalized through an artistic institution. We will see what happens when a personal legacy is entrusted to a collective structure, and why that process, while necessary, further pushes the original spirit of Henri and Marie Clouse away from the center of history. Following Marie Clouse's death, the question ceased to be whether Château de la Napoule would survive. The real, more difficult, and less frequently asked question was what form it would take. In the history of conservation, this has always been the most critical moment. Not when the building faces the risk of physical collapse, but when it faces the risk of being redefined according to needs other than the spiritual needs that created it. The establishment of the La Napoule Art Foundation marked a crucial turning point. In practical terms, the organization ensured that Napoule would not fall into the hands of private investors, would not be fragmented, and would not be transformed into a luxury resort villa or a seaside hotel. In the context of the increasingly commercialized Riviera, this was a significant victory. Napoule was protected from the common fate of many other historical buildings, being excessively beautified to serve consumer purposes. But all protection comes with conditions. An organization needs processes, clear goals, and the ability to explain its existence to the public, to sponsors, and to local authorities. And it is here that Napoule's original spirit begins to come under pressure. Not through direct denial, but through the standardization of language. Napoule is presented as an international arts center, an artist's retreat, a cultural exchange hub. All of that is true. But in the process of telling that story, the unsettling elements of Henri and Marie Clouse's legacy are gradually pushed aside. The aspects of social critique, irony toward power, and uncompromising attitude toward mainstream structures are softened, becoming context rather than core content. This is not a deliberate act of erasure. It is a consequence of how cultural institutions typically operate. An overly sharp legacy is unlikely to endure in the public sphere. It needs to be translated into a safer language to gain wider acceptance. And in that translation process, what is often lost is not information, but tension. The artist residency programs at Napoule breathe new life into the place. Artists from many countries come and go, leaving behind works, experiences, and diverse perspectives. Napoule becomes a breeding ground for new art, not just a repository of old art. But this very richness also creates a new layer, blurring the original narrative. Napoule is gradually seen as a neutral platform for creativity, rather than a powerful personal statement. In the introductory materials, Henri and Marie Clouse are still mentioned, but often in the role of patrons of the arts, restorers of a beautiful castle, rather than individuals living in conflict with the very system that gave birth to them. This difference may seem small, but its consequences are enormous. It transforms Napoule from an argument into a place, from an open question into a pleasant answer. Part 5 is not intended to criticize the La Napoule Art Foundation. On the contrary, without this organization, Napoule might have disappeared entirely. But its very existence reveals a profound paradox. For an unacceptable legacy to survive, it must accept being misunderstood. And in that incompleteness, mainstream history continues its familiar work, not by erasing, but by lowering its volume. Napoule, in this phase, is like a voice retained in a room, but required to speak more softly, more slowly, and avoid topics that would upset the listener. It remains present, still cared for, still loved. But the sharpness that once set it apart gradually becomes a deeper layer, only for those patient enough to discover. Part 5 concludes with a crucial realization: saving a heritage does not mean preserving its original meaning. A gap always exists between preservation and interpretation. And it is within this gap that the spirit of Henri and Marie Clouse continues to drift away from orthodox history, not because it is denied, but because it is made too readily acceptable. In the next part, the story will shift to Napoleon's physical space in the latter half of the 20th century, to see how architecture and sculpture, though enveloped by new interpretations, continue to subtly resist simplification. After the legacy of Henri and Marie Clouse was placed within the operational framework of an organization, the story seemed to have found stability. But Château de la Napoule is not a place that accepts stability in the conventional sense. There are spaces that, despite careful management, display, and presentation, constantly create friction with the interpretations imposed upon them. Napoule is one such space. It doesn't protest verbally. It protests structurally. The first thing Napoule architecture does is reject the center. There is no grand hall leading the experience. There is no axis of symmetry guiding the viewer to a point of power. Instead, there are jagged pathways, unexpected courtyards, narrow corridors that open into light and then close into darkness. This fragmentation is not accidental. It breaks the habit of receiving heritage as a series of easily memorable highlights. The visitor cannot grasp Napoule in a holistic view. They are forced to go, stop, turn back, and sometimes get lost. It is this very disorientation that renders any simple explanation insufficient. No matter what the information board says, no matter how fluent the commentary, the viewer's body experiences something else, a feeling of incomplete guidance. And that is where memory begins to operate in its own way. The space compels one to question, not about age or style, but about intention. Why is this statue here? Why wasn't that carving made more beautiful? Why does the stone wall face directly towards the sea without seeking protection from the salty wind? These details don't need historical explanation to be effective. They function as fragments of physical memory, resisting being relegated to neutral decoration. A stone face looking down into a courtyard offers no solace. A distorted human figure doesn't invite admiration. These choices reveal what Henry and Marie Clouse intended. Art does not exist to soothe the world, but to keep it from falling asleep. In the latter half of the 20th century, as art exhibitions continued, Napoule accumulated new layers of meaning. But these layers did not erase the old ones. On the contrary, they created overlap. A contemporary work displayed in a space already inherently critical placed both in a state of tension. The space did not submit to the new work, nor could the new work completely dominate the space. The viewer stood in the middle, realizing that Napoule was not a backdrop. It was a dialogue. This dialogue often took place in silence. During quiet hours, when light slowly glided across the stone surface, Napoule revealed its true nature. Not as a framed monument, but as a body still breathing. The walls retained the heat of the day, releasing the coolness of the night. The sea breeze carries salt into every crevice of the rocks. These things remind us that architecture is not a dead object. It remembers by enduring. Therefore, every attempt to thin the spirit of Napoule only reaches a certain limit. You can rewrite the story in a safe way. You can make the experience more friendly. But you cannot erase the subtle unease that this place creates. That feeling is not a design flaw, it is at its core. And that core continues to convey what mainstream history often avoids, that there are lives, there are choices that cannot be reduced to neat lessons. Part 6 sets a crucial conclusion for the entire film legacy, lies not only in the content told, but in how the space forces people to behave. Napoule forces people to slow down. It forces people to observe the unannotated. It forces people to accept uncertainty. That is why, though saved from physical collapse, the original spirit of Henry and Marie Clouse was not erased. It was merely pushed deeper, to a place where quick interpretations cannot reach. As Part 6 concludes, Napoule is no longer seen as a single example. It becomes representative of a rare kind of heritage, a heritage that resists being fully understood. And it is this resistance that keeps it alive, not in history books, but in the direct experience of each person who walks through it. In the next part, the story will shift its focus to the viewer, the modern individuals facing Napoule today. It is no longer a question of the past, but a question of present responsibility when confronted with a heritage that refuses to speak aloud. Will we listen, or will we continue to demand that it be made more understandable? At this point, the story can no longer continue simply by talking about Château de la Napoule, or about Henry and Marie Clouse as historical figures who have completed their roles. Because once the space is handed over to the public, history enters a different state. It is no longer the property of its creator, nor entirely the property of its custodians. It begins to live on through the way the viewer is present. There is no ritual requiring silence upon entering Napoule. There are no rules demanding solemn reverence, as in national monuments. But it is precisely this absence of ritual that creates an invisible pressure. Viewers are compelled to adjust their pace, decide their level of attention, and question how they should be present. Napoule doesn't say, "Respect me." It asks, "What are you looking for when you enter?" In the 21st century, viewers bring with them habits entirely different from those of Henry and Marie Clouse's generation. We are accustomed to absorbing history through highlights, through summaries, through stories optimized for memorability and shareability. But Napoleon resists that rhythm. There is no ideal tour route, no climax moment that compels everyone to pause. Instead, there is a series of uneven experiences, where each person takes away a different feeling and no one can be sure they have understood correctly. It is this uncertainty that makes the viewer a part of the story. They no longer stand outside of history observing. They are drawn into an ongoing interpretive process. When someone stops before a distorted statue, they are forced to ask, what does this symbolize? Or is it merely a deliberately created source of discomfort? When a person sits down in a quiet corner of the courtyard, listening to the sea breeze rustling through the rocks, they confront a form of memory without explanation. And in that moment, history is no longer something completed, it becomes a relationship. This is especially significant for the story of Henry and Marie Clouse. These two individuals spent their lives avoiding being fully defined by others. They left no manifesto, no demand for posterity to understand them in any particular way. In doing so, they entrusted Napoule with a heavy but honest responsibility to force each generation to confront its heritage, rather than consume it as a finished product. Here, a paradox emerges. The more people visit Napoule, the greater the chance it will be simplified. Each snapshot, each brief description, risks turning the place into a beautiful but empty image. But at the same time, each individual who truly takes the time to stay, to slow down, to observe carefully, contributes to preserving the original spirit. This legacy is not protected by fences or laws, but by the viewer's choice to be present. This part 7, therefore, is not just about Napoule, but about us. It poses the question that every lengthy historical documentary must confront at the end: what is the role of the viewer? Do we come to be entertained, to learn more, or to be challenged? Napoule doesn't force an answer, but it doesn't allow the viewer to leave completely unscathed. There's always a feeling that something remains unsaid, unfinished, and that feeling follows the viewer out of the stone gate. At this stage of the story, history is no longer a flow from past to present. It becomes a loop. Each person who enters Napoule brings their own context, and that context determines what they see. An artist sees a space for dialogue. A traveler sees a strange castle. A researcher sees a case of heritage that is difficult to categorize. No one is wrong, but no one has the right to claim to hold the entire meaning. Part 7 concludes with a subtle but significant shift. From here, the story no longer belongs to Napoule as an object, but to the relationship between Napoule and its contemporaries. Henry and Marie Clouse, in this way, are not erased by history. They withdraw to make way for a different form of existence, where heritage is not protected by consensus, but by the conscious attention of each individual. In the next part, the penultimate part of the entire narrative, the story will expand one more step. From Napoleon, we will look at similar legacies around the world, places and people also silenced by mainstream history, to see that this story is not an exception, but a recurring pattern of how power chooses memory. At this point, the story can no longer continue simply by talking about Château de la Napoule, or about Henry and Marie Clouse as historical figures who have completed their roles. Because once the space is handed over to the public, history enters a different state. It is no longer the property of its creator, nor entirely the property of its custodians. It begins to live on through the way the viewer is present. There is no ritual requiring silence upon entering Napoule. There are no rules demanding solemn reverence, as in national monuments. But it is precisely this absence of ritual that creates an invisible pressure. Viewers are compelled to adjust their pace, decide their level of attention, and question how they should be present. Napoule doesn't say, "Respect me." It asks, "What are you looking for when you enter?" In the 21st century, Viewers bring with them habits entirely different from those of Henry and Marie Clou's generation. We are accustomed to absorbing history through highlights, through summaries, through stories optimized for memorability and shareability. But Napoleon resists that rhythm. There is no ideal tour route, no climax moment that compels everyone to pause. Instead, there is a series of uneven experiences where each person takes away a different feeling, and no one can be sure they have understood correctly. It is this uncertainty that makes the viewer a part of the story. They no longer stand outside of history observing, they are drawn into an ongoing interpretive process. When someone stops before a distorted statue, they are forced to ask, what does this symbolize? Or is it merely a deliberately created source of discomfort? When a person sits down in a quiet corner of the courtyard, listening to the sea breeze rustling through the rocks, they confront a form of memory without explanation. And in that moment, history is no longer something completed. It becomes a relationship. This is especially significant for the story of Henry and Marie Clou's. These two individuals spent their lives avoiding being fully defined by others. They left no manifesto, no demand for posterity to understand them in any particular way. In doing so, they entrusted Napoule with a heavy but honest responsibility to force each generation to confront its heritage, rather than consume it as a finished product. Here, a paradox emerges. The more people visit Napoule, the greater the chance it will be simplified. Each snapshot, each brief description, risks turning the place into a beautiful but empty image. But at the same time, each individual who truly takes the time to stay, to slow down, to observe carefully, contributes to preserving the original spirit. This legacy is not protected by fences or laws, but by the viewer's choice to be present. This part 7, therefore, is not just about Napoule, but about us. It poses the question that every lengthy historical documentary must confront at the end. What is the role of the viewer? Do we come to be entertained, to learn more, or to be challenged? Napoule doesn't force an answer, but it doesn't allow the viewer to leave completely unscathed. There's always a feeling that something remains unsaid, unfinished, and that feeling follows the viewer out of the stone gate. At this stage of the story, history is no longer a flow from past to present. It becomes a loop. Each person who enters Napoule brings their own context, and that context determines what they see. An artist sees a space for dialogue. A traveler sees a strange castle. A researcher sees a case of heritage that is difficult to categorize. No one is wrong, but no one has the right to claim to hold the entire meaning. Part 7 concludes with a subtle but significant shift. From here, the story no longer belongs to Napoule as an object, but to the relationship between Napoule and its contemporaries. Henry and Marie Clou's, in this way, are not erased by history. They withdraw to make way for a different form of existence, where heritage is not protected by consensus, but by the conscious attention of each individual. In the next part, the penultimate part of the entire narrative, the story will expand one more step. From Napoleon, we will look at similar legacies around the world, places and people also silenced by mainstream history, to see that this story is not an exception, but a recurring pattern of how power chooses memory. As the film draws to a close, Château de la Napoule stands there, unchanged, offering no conclusion. The morning light glides across the stone surface, weathered by time and sea salt. The Mediterranean Sea neither appears as a witness nor as a judge. It simply continues to move, as it did before the castle, and will continue to do so after all stories about it have faded. At this point, the question is no longer whether Henry and Marie Clou's receive official historical recognition. Throughout the story, it has become clear that they did not live to await such recognition. They lived in a century obsessed with progress, power, and structures that considered themselves eternal. And they chose a different place, where existence did not need to be validated by name or central role. Napoule is the result of that choice, not as a grand statement, but as a lasting steadfastness. Orthodox history often ends with a summary. It prefers clear answers: who was right, who was wrong, what is memorable, what can be left behind. But Napoule does not allow such an ending. It refuses to be an illustration of a moral lesson. It also refuses to be a symbol of injustice that needs to be rectified. Instead, it exists as a pause, where the viewer must decide for themselves what remains after all explanations have been exhausted. In that pause, an uncomfortable truth gradually emerges. Not every meaningful life needs to be placed at the center of history. There are lives that, when placed at the center, lose the very thing that made them important. Henry and Marie Clouse are not forgotten because they failed. They are obscured because they do not fit the way history prefers to tell its story. And paradoxically, it is this very blurring that allows their legacy to exist in a more flexible way, not confined to a single version. Napoule doesn't demand that one remember the names of every builder or every historical period it traversed. It demands something else, something far more difficult: attention. Not explosive attention, not fleeting interest, but conscious presence. As the viewer slows down, as they allow the space to act before seeking explanation, Napoule begins to perform its deepest function. It doesn't teach, it doesn't persuade. It makes one question. In the final minutes of the film, the narrative no longer guides. The imagery no longer attempts to illustrate a point. Only time, light, and the silent stone structure remain. This is not a lack of content. This is a deliberate choice. For if this story ended with a clear conclusion, it would betray the very spirit of Napoule. A place created to live outside of convenient conclusions. When viewers leave the film, what they carry with them should not be the feeling of having understood Château de la Napoule. That would be too comfortable, too concise. What remains, if the film fulfills its role, is a subtle unease, a quiet doubt about how history is written, about stories repeated over and over, and about other stories pushed to the margins not because they are small, but because they refuse to submit. Château de la Napoule, in this final moment, is no longer a specific place in southern France. It becomes an open metaphor, about people living within systems but not belonging to them, about legacies that survive not through glorification, but through resistance to being made understandable. And history, not as a complete record, but as a continuous process of selection, where silence sometimes speaks louder than words. The film ends here, not because the story is over, but because further words would detract from the most important thing: the space for the viewer to reflect. Napoleon stands there. The sea continues to move, and history, as always, continues its journey, carrying with it both what it has recorded and what it chooses to remain silent about. If you're still sitting here, after the story has ended, after the last images have faded, then perhaps what you just saw wasn't just a documentary. Perhaps it evoked a familiar feeling, a feeling difficult to name. Not the satisfaction of having understood everything, but a slight void where the question lingers longer than the answer. History is often told as a continuous flow. Names are clear, victory, defeat, cause, effect. But stories like this are different. They don't try to convince you. They simply exist and wait for you to come close enough to listen. This channel wasn't created to keep up with the fast pace of the modern world. Not created to provide concise knowledge or easily remembered facts that are quickly replaced. This channel exists for stories that aren't told loudly, people who aren't at the center of power, places that don't fit familiar historical stereotypes, and legacies that don't want to be understood too quickly. Here, we're not trying to answer every question, because sometimes keeping the question open is more honest than any conclusion. If you're looking for films that are told more slowly, are more deeply researched, and are respected in the inherent complexity of history, then you're in the right place. Subscribing to the channel isn't an act of watching more. It's a choice to stay longer with stories that aren't rushed. Each film on this channel is made not to make noise, but to create a space. A space where history isn't forced to be easily understood, and where viewers aren't asked to agree. If you believe that history is made not only by the victors, but also by those who are sidelined, if you feel that what history silences sometimes speaks volumes, and if you are willing to take the time for stories that don't give you an immediate sense of completion, then subscribe to the channel. Not to follow new content, but to continue a longer dialogue with the past. A dialogue without a clear ending, but deep enough to change how we see the world today. Thank you for staying this far. And if you choose to continue, we will tell you stories that history has passed through, but never stopped long enough to listen to.